Smallpox killed roughly 300 million people in the 20th century. The standard estimate places it among the deadliest single causes of human mortality in any century, and it had been killing humans in successive epidemics across every populated continent for at least 3,000 years. It killed pharaohs, Inca emperors, Russian czars, and a long line of European monarchs. It blinded, disfigured, and terrified every human generation that came before the one I am speaking to. On the 8th of May, 1980, the World Health Organization declared it gone. Not controlled, not rare. Gone. The last natural case had been diagnosed about 2.5 years earlier in a 23-year-old Somali hospital cook called Ali Maow Maalin, and the virus now exists only in 2 high-security freezers, one in Atlanta, one in a research compound east of Novosibirsk. This happened during the most dangerous decade of the Cold War, and it happened because a narrow coalition of doctors, with less money in their global budget than a single year of the Apollo program, refused to stop until it was done. This is how. You have to begin with the disease, because the achievement only makes sense at the scale of the enemy. Variola major, the main strain, killed about 3 in every 10 people who caught it, and for those who survived, the disease left a pattern of permanent scars across the face and body that was unmistakable for the rest of their lives. Many survivors were also left blind. The classical accounts go back to ancient Egypt. There is a mummy in Cairo, the body of Pharaoh Ramses V, whose face still shows what appear to be smallpox pustules. The disease shaped political history. Smallpox is one of the diseases that arrived with European contact in the Americas in the 15th and 16th centuries and produced demographic collapses on a scale that no military campaign has ever matched. The Inca Empire was broken open by a smallpox epidemic in the years before the Spanish conquest, in which the Inca ruler Huayna Capac and his designated heir both died, triggering the civil war that Pizarro then walked into. Elizabeth I of England survived an attack in 1562, and the marks on her face, which historians since have politely described as being concealed by cosmetics, were smallpox scars. Mary II of England died of it, and so did Louis XV of France. By the middle of the 20th century, the United States, Britain, and most of continental Europe had effectively eliminated the disease through routine vaccination of their own populations. In the United States, between 1948 and 1965, only 1 person died of smallpox. By 1967, smallpox was gone from North America and Europe. But it was killing somewhere between 10 and 15 million people a year in the parts of the world where vaccination programs had not reached. And the last American outbreak, in 1949, had needed 50,000 pints of vaccine and crowds of New Yorkers queuing in the streets to put down a single imported case. It killed about 3 in 10 of the people it infected. It had been killing humans for as long as there had been written history. And then, over the course of 2 decades, a small coalition of public health doctors ended it. The proposal came from a place almost no one expected. In May 1958, at the 11th World Health Assembly in Minneapolis, a Soviet deputy minister of health called Viktor Zhdanov stood up and proposed that the World Health Organization commit itself to the global eradication of smallpox. His argument was technical, not ideological. The smallpox vaccine, derived from the cowpox virus discovered by Edward Jenner in 1796, was extraordinarily effective. The disease had no animal reservoir, which meant that breaking human-to-human transmission everywhere would break it permanently. The symptoms were unmistakable, and the cases could be found. The vaccine itself had a logistical problem that limited its reach in tropical and remote countries. Once thawed, it had to be used within about 18 hours or it stopped working. But a laboratory in London had already developed a freeze-dried, rehydratable version that could be stored and transported far more cheaply. The technical case for eradication was, in 1958, stronger than the technical case for any other disease the World Health Organization had ever attempted to eliminate. The Americans were skeptical, not opposed in principle, but unconvinced that it could be done because other eradication campaigns, including yellow fever, hookworm, and malaria, had each promised what they could not deliver. The Soviet proposal was passed in 1959 as World Health Assembly Resolution 11.54, and it launched a program, but the program was, in its early years, almost entirely paper. For the next 7 years, the World Health Organization's smallpox program had a budget of roughly $100,000 a year, with the actual vaccination work being done by national health ministries using whatever resources they could muster. Cases continued to occur in roughly 43 countries across Africa, Asia, and South America. The disease was getting smaller, but it was not going away, and by 1966, anyone honest could see that the original plan was not going to work. In 1966, the World Health Assembly voted to increase the budget for the smallpox program to a new figure of approximately $2.4 million a year, a small number in any context, and a particularly small number when set against the scale of what it was being asked to do. The Assembly's resolution gave the new program a target: eradicate smallpox from the planet within 10 years. The choice of 10 years was not accidental. President Kennedy had set the United States the 10-year target of putting a man on the moon in 1961, and the public health architecture of the 1960s was self-consciously borrowing the moonshot framing. A bounded technical objective with a specific deadline, a single named program office, and the political cover for the office to do its work. The moonshot was, in 1966, 3 years from succeeding. The staff who designed the new program were watching a model of how a narrow, time-boxed, technically led program could be made to work. The smallpox program would, in the end, deliver its 10-year target 3 years late. That is, by the standards of large public programs, on time. The man they put in charge was Donald Ainsley Henderson, a 38-year-old epidemiologist at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, who was American, who had no diplomatic title, and whose official position was chief of the smallpox eradication unit at the World Health Organization in Geneva. His authority, what authority he had, came from the technical credibility of the unit he ran, the patience of the World Health Assembly, and his own willingness to fly into countries where most career-track public health doctors did not want to go. Henderson's tenure overlapped with a strategic insight that, in the end, mattered more than any single budget line. The original plan had been mass vaccination. Vaccinate as many people as possible in countries where smallpox was endemic, drive vaccination rates above the 80% threshold that epidemiologists thought might be needed for herd immunity, and watch the disease starve. And the Indian program had been attempting exactly this for years. India in 1953 had recorded approximately 253,000 cases of smallpox. India had vaccinated about 200 million people in the years that followed. India still had smallpox. The breakthrough came not from headquarters but from the field. In 1966, a young American CDC epidemiologist called William Foege was working in eastern Nigeria when an outbreak broke out in a religious community that had refused vaccination, even though more than 90% of the surrounding country was already vaccinated, and Foge's team found they did not have enough vaccine to immunize everybody in the region. Unable to vaccinate everyone, Foege improvised. His team mapped every reported case, vaccinated everyone in the affected village, isolated the cases themselves, then walked the perimeter into neighboring villages and rechecked them weekly until the chain went cold. The outbreak ended. The country went smallpox-free with a fraction of the vaccine the mass vaccination model would have required. Foege called the strategy surveillance-and-containment, and Henderson, back in Geneva, recognized what Foege had found, defended it against the senior public health establishment of the time, and converted it from a Nigerian field improvisation into the global doctrine of the entire program. It is the kind of insight that, once you have heard it, sounds obvious, and it was not obvious. It cut against the prevailing public health doctrine, and it required Henderson to defend the strategy at the World Health Assembly against colleagues whose careers had been built on mass vaccination programs. The strategy was approved. It worked. The insight worth carrying away is that a better strategy can sometimes win a war that more funding alone cannot. The program did not get vastly more money. It got a better idea, found by one man in eastern Nigeria, defended by another in Geneva, and allowed to deploy. The cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union on this program is one of the cleanest examples I can find, in any policy domain, of two superpowers doing useful work together, while their official posture toward each other was nuclear deterrence. The Soviet Union supplied the vaccine. By the end of the program, the USSR had contributed roughly 1.5 billion doses, donated rather than sold, distributed through the World Health Organization to the 43 countries where the disease was still endemic. The United States funded most of the operational cost. American epidemiologists provided the bulk of the senior fieldwork staff. And the CDC in Atlanta was, for the duration of the program, the operational backbone, posting disease detectives into countries where most career-track public health doctors did not want to go. The freeze-dried vaccine that made all this physically possible had come, a few years before, from a laboratory in London. Before freeze-drying, smallpox vaccine had to be used within 18 hours of being thawed, which had been fine in Europe and North America, where there were enough refrigerators and enough trained doctors close enough to the patient, and useless in the parts of the world where most of the disease actually was. The freeze-dried vaccine, by contrast, could be carried in a coat pocket in 40-degree heat for weeks, reconstituted with a drop of clean water, and given by somebody who had never seen a hospital. The same technology that puts coffee in a tin and food in a space capsule is the technology that ended smallpox. The program served each side's interests. The Soviet Union could demonstrate that socialist medicine produced a global public good. The United States could demonstrate that it could lead a multilateral health program that was not dominated by superpower competition. Neither side was being noble. Both sides were behaving as states behave when their interests align, and what the smallpox program proves is that those interests for 14 years did. Henderson worked closely with his Soviet counterpart Dmitry Venediktov, a deputy minister of health who, like Zhdanov before him, took the program seriously enough to attend the technical meetings, not just the political ones. By the operational record, the two men ran the program together for over a decade without a public quarrel about the politics of their respective governments. The World Health Organization was, in this story, the forum that made the cooperation possible. Neither superpower would have accepted the other taking direct credit. Both could accept the World Health Organization taking it. Cooperation worked here because it was laundered through a narrow, technical, non-political institution with a specific mandate, and because that institution was allowed to stay narrow. Grand schemes break, specific schemes sometimes succeed. It is worth pausing on the parallel calendar. The smallpox program ran from 1966 to 1980. In the same window, the United States and the Soviet Union signed the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention in 1972, promising not to develop biological weapons, a promise the Soviet side, we now know, was already breaking inside its own military laboratories. The two governments were cooperating on a public health program and lying to each other about biological weapons at the same time. The lesson is not that one cancels out the other. The lesson is that both happen. A narrow technical institution with a specific mandate can sometimes get useful work out of two governments that are, in every other respect, adversarial. That is rarer than it should be. It is also not nothing. The groundwork was done on foot. In India alone, at the peak of the eradication effort, approximately 152,000 Indian health workers and 230 World Health Organization personnel were searching for cases, walking, knocking on doors, going into hospitals, schools, markets, festivals, and refugee camps. And every reported case generated a containment ring of vaccinated household members, neighbors, and village contacts, with the area rechecked weekly until the chain was broken. In Bangladesh, the same pattern, In Ethiopia, which was experiencing both Variola major and the milder Variola minor strain, the same. In Somalia, the last battleground, the same. The recognition step rested on a simple fact about the disease. Smallpox is unmistakable. The pustular rash on the face, hands, and feet, present in the same pattern in every case, meant that someone who had seen smallpox once would not forget what it looked like, in any language, with or without medical training. Field workers carried recognition cards with the pattern shown on them, walked into villages, showed the card, and asked whether anybody had seen this. A search method that worked across the cultures and the languages of 43 countries on foot, on the strength of one photograph. One of the medical detectives the CDC sent into India during this period was a woman named Mary Ginnon. Her assignment was to establish 10-mile rings of vaccination around each new smallpox patient in her region, a region that was sometimes only accessible by camel, and once, for 3 weeks, only by elephant, when a local benefactor lent Ginnon and her team the use of one. Donald Henderson, back in Geneva, approved the unusual expenditure on the elephant's driver. He was reportedly fond of saying, in the years afterwards, that he had had to justify payments for Mary Ginnon's elephant. 3 decades later, at the 30th anniversary CDC reunion, Ginnon corrected him in person. The payments, she pointed out, had been for the driver. The World Health Organization could not afford an elephant. The Indian eradication numbers, in retrospect, are extraordinary. From the recorded high of approximately 253,000 cases in 1953, India was down to 1,436 cases in 1975 and 0 cases in 1976. There was a piece of equipment that deserves a sentence of its own. The bifurcated needle, a small American-invented metal device looking like a 2-pronged fork with a piece of wire between the prongs, designed by Benjamin Rubin at Wyeth Laboratories in 1965, held the correct dose of vaccine between its 2 points by capillary action, was jabbed into the skin to deliver the vaccine, could be sterilized and reused about 200 times, and could be used effectively by somebody with no medical training. It used about a quarter of the vaccine dose of a regular syringe, allowed the same vial of vaccine to immunize 4 times as many people, and cost roughly $5 per 1,000 needles to manufacture. It is one of the smaller technological contributions to ending a major human disease in history, and it cut the vaccine consumption of the global program by about 3/4. On the 16th of October, 1975, in Bangladesh, a 3-year-old girl called Rahima Banu broke out in a rash. She was quickly isolated, the containment ring was vaccinated, and she recovered. The chain of Variola major, after 3,000 years of human history, ended in a Bangladeshi village in the autumn of 1975. After Rahima, the disease persisted only in its milder strain, Variola minor, and only in the Horn of Africa. The last natural case of smallpox anywhere on Earth was diagnosed on the 26th of October, 1977, in the Somali coastal town of Merka, in a 23-year-old hospital cook named Ali Maow Maalin. He worked at the local hospital. He had not been vaccinated, despite working in healthcare. He briefly assisted in escorting a smallpox case to an isolation ward, and that was enough. The strain was Variola minor, case fatality around 10%, compared to 30% or more for the major strain, and Maalin survived. He recovered fully and went back to work in his own country. After Ali Maow Maalin, no one else caught it naturally. Not in 1978, not in 1979, not in the 4 decades since. There is a footnote to that last sentence, and it is the only one that needs to be said. In 1978, a year after Maalin's case, a medical photographer at the University of Birmingham in England called Janet Parker contracted smallpox from a sample being handled in the laboratory below her office. She died. The laboratory was closed. The director of the lab took his own life shortly afterwards. The Birmingham case was the last person to die of smallpox, and it was a laboratory accident, not a natural transmission. After 1980, the World Health Organization moved to consolidate the world's remaining smallpox samples into just 2 facilities, the CDC in Atlanta and a research compound called VECTOR, the State Research Center of Virology and Biotechnology, located east of Novosibirsk in southern Siberia. Those 2 freezers still hold the virus. The proposed destruction of the remaining stocks has been deferred at every meeting of the World Health Assembly since the 1990s. Some people believing the stocks should be destroyed as a final gesture of completion. Others, including most of the surviving senior public health figures who ran the original program, believing they should be preserved against the possibility that the disease could return through means we cannot now predict. The argument is also, occasionally, complicated by inconvenient discoveries. On the 1st of July, 2014, a forgotten cardboard box was found at a National Institutes of Health Research Center in Bethesda, Maryland. The box contained vials of smallpox dating from the 1950s, the first unaccounted-for traces of the virus on American soil. The official accounting of where the world's smallpox stocks had been until that morning wrong. The argument continues. The freezers in Atlanta and Novosibirsk remain locked. The vials at Bethesda have, in the standard formulation, been secured. On the 8th of May, 1980, the World Health Assembly passed Resolution 33.3, which declared, in plain language, that smallpox had been eradicated from the human population. It is 1 sentence long. It is, in some sense, the most consequential single sentence ever written by the World Health Organization. The cost of the entire program from 1966 through 1980 has been estimated at approximately $300 million in total, with roughly 2/3 of that coming from in-country expenditure by the affected nations themselves, and the direct World Health Organization budget amounting to about $64 million in cash and kind across 14 years. For reference, the Apollo program, running over a similar period, cost about $25 billion in 1970s money. Smallpox eradication cost approximately 1.25% of that, and the output was the permanent removal of a human disease that had killed 300 million people in the previous century. As public policy interventions go, this is what a good return on investment looks like. The permanent end of a disease that killed by the hundreds of millions, at the cost of a vaccine, a needle, and walking boots. There is a question worth asking honestly, because it bears on every public health debate of the present. Why has nothing else been eradicated since? Polio has come close. 2 of the 3 wild polio strains have been declared eradicated. The 3rd has been pushed back to a small handful of countries and roughly 40 reported cases in 2025. But the campaign has been almost done for over a decade, and almost, in a program aiming for 0, is not the same as done. Guinea worm disease, the other long-running eradication effort, has been reduced from roughly 3.5 million cases a year in the 1980s to about 10 human cases in 2025. Mostly in a small number of African countries. Both programs are still running, neither has yet finished. The honest answer is that smallpox was eradicable for a combination of reasons that have not all recurred together since. The disease had no animal reservoir, so it could not hide between human outbreaks. The symptoms were obvious, so cases could be found by sight. The vaccine was extremely effective and remained effective even when given shortly after exposure. And the geopolitical window of the late 1960s and 70s happened to be one in which both superpowers were willing to cooperate on a narrow technical project. None of those conditions is guaranteed for the next eradication candidate. Polio has been complicated by the fact that the oral vaccine, in rare cases, can mutate into a strain that itself causes paralytic polio. Guinea worm has been complicated by political instability in the regions where it survives. Malaria has no human-only reservoir because the parasite spends part of its life in mosquitoes, which are not interested in being vaccinated. The smallpox program proved that eradication is possible. It did not prove that eradication is generally easy. It is worth being honest about that, because other public health interventions are still worth doing even when they cannot promise eradication. But once in the 20th century, the recipe came together. We followed it. It worked. Somewhere in Atlanta, in a freezer locked behind several layers of access control, the last American samples of Variola sit in deep frozen storage. Somewhere east of Novosibirsk, in the VECTOR research compound, the last Russian samples sit under the same conditions. Both have been counted, catalogued, and held in place for the better part of half a century. The institutional argument is plain. When a public health institution is kept narrow, given a specific technical mandate, a measurable target, and the room to do its work without being asked to launder anyone's prestige, it can sometimes finish what grand schemes cannot. When the same kind of institution is allowed to become vague, accountable to nobody on a specific question, it does not finish anything, it grows. The polio and guinea worm campaigns will need the architecture that finished smallpox to finish themselves. That architecture is not a mystery. It exists. It was built once. It can be built again. Ali Maow Maalin became a polio vaccinator after his recovery, and he worked for the Somali polio campaign for the next 30 years. On the 22nd of July, 2013, he died of malaria while on a polio vaccination round in central Somalia. He was 59 years old. He was the last person in the world to catch smallpox naturally. He was also, until the day he died, one of the people working hardest to make sure he would be the last to catch someone else's disease too.